Welcome everybody to tonight's Fabian session on Re-envisaging ACC for the 21st century. It's a delight to welcome Glenn Barclay, Hazel Armstrong and Hilary Stace, members of the ACC Futures Coalition, who'll speak to us tonight about ACC in the context of the neoliberal framework. Sorry about this, Mike. The immediate changes we need, how ACC fails the disability community, and that's certainly a particular interest for Mary and I, and reflections on our way forward. So I understand Glenn will start off. Welcome, Glenn, and look forward to hearing from you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. We're here talking on the back of a very successful one-day conference at the ACC Futures Coalition held on the 30th of April under this title. And as Mike said, we've got 4 topics he wanted us to touch on today. And so I'm going to do the first bit about the neoliberal context. And I know that we had Len Cook doing this topic for us very successfully at the conference, and I'm going to have to take a bit more of a narrow view than Len did then. Hazel will talk about the immediate changes that we need, and Hilary will talk about how ACC fails the disability community, and then I'll say a couple of words about reflections on the way forward. And we'll try and keep ourselves to around about 10 minutes each. So I think before I get into that, I just want to say a couple of opening comments about why now. And it feels like there is a bit of a window opening for us to push at, or a door ajar, or whatever metaphor you want to use. The first thing is that both Labour and the Greens' policies on ACC opened, the possibility that they would look at the scheme. The Greens, of course, were quite revolutionary. They wanted a significant change. They were talking about a new social care agency that would really involve a wide rethink of ACC. Labour, of course, was much more cautious, but they did say that they were interested in looking, amongst other things, looking at the disparity of treatment between people who incur a disability through injury and accident and those who, through either born with disability or gain a disability through illness. So that, of course, sets the scene for everything else, but it's just worth noting the kind of stuff that we're seeing in the media that seems to be gathering pace. I've just got some of them down there. There seems to be a lot of stories at the moment around the boundaries, that grey area about what things ACC covers and what things it doesn't cover, which seems to be becoming increasingly blurred as society changes and as the pressures on the scheme change. So that's just a list of things that I just picked up over recent months that were in the media that suggest to us that there is growing pressure on the scheme alongside the possibility that the governments might be willing to look at some kind of change. So just before we talk about the neoliberal framework, we need to just reflect about the scheme itself, on the values in which it was underpinned. And those of you who are familiar with ACC will well remember the Woodhouse report of 1967, which the whole scheme was based, and in particular the 5 significant Woodhouse Principles that underpinned the scheme. Community responsibility, in particular, the notion that, particularly for that we all contribute to society. We all do things. Some of us engage in activities that are perhaps more risky than others. Others who are not in paid work but who still contribute significantly to society. They should all be covered. We all have a responsibility as a community to make sure that everyone in New Zealand is covered, and that's a really important one, along with the notion of comprehensive entitlement. And these two principles, as Sir Owen himself observed in 2008 at one of our seminars when he was still with us, both embrace and emphasize the social welfare nature and purpose of the comprehensive assistance that was required. Third is the importance of complete rehabilitation, and that's an area that we feel that ACC probably hasn't done so well in, and Hazel in particular will make comments about some of the areas where that's been problematic. Real compensation and administrative efficiency, see out the 5 principles. So I think it's also just reflecting on ACC as social insurance, and this is a quote from Sir Owen again at the same presentation he'd made to a seminar we ran in 2008, in which he points out that private insurance has absolute limitations, which mean that it cannot actually deliver what is in essence a social service. And the fact that the term social insurance is one that over the years the social part has tended to be lost in some of the debates that have occurred. So what did we get? In essence, we got a world first scheme in 1974. It was a huge change, a very significant change. A no-fault scheme which went hand in hand with the loss of the right to sue for damages if you incurred an injury because you received your compensation through the scheme and you received your medical treatment through the scheme. It was extended to those who were injured outside of work, so it was comprehensive in that regard, but obviously it stopped short of the very critical issue of supporting those who incurred disability through illness or through birth. And so Owen himself at the time thought that the scheme should always extend to those groups, and saw a temporary arrangement on the way, but of course that has not still been remedied. There was a government agency, not private insurance, a commission, a 3-person commission to deliver a social service, funded on a pay-as-you-go basis with levies based on industry classifications according to risk. And that was one of the many compromises that were unfortunately made at the time, because that was a private insurance principle that found its way into the founding document, that you looked at an industry to assess risk and you charged fees according to that, whereas Sir Owen was recommending a flat rate levy on the basis of community responsibility, and we're all in this together. So the neoliberal context, it's worth just reflecting on, reminding ourselves about what we mean by neoliberalism. It's an ideology that's been around for a long time, but obviously gave a lot of currency with the reforms of the 80s and the Labour government at the time, and obviously the 90s, which we all remember with a great deal of anger and sadness. I'm a big fan of George Monbiot. This is a definition from him, and I won't read it out, but it's the essence of a competitive marketplace, where the place in which human choices and democratic choices are exercised through that mechanism. It has a strong emphasis on individualism and pushing back on the role of the state. So in the context of ACC, that tends to be an emphasis on the insurance over the social, the insurance being the individual, and the individual taking care of their own needs through a private insurance model. So if we just reflect over the years, there's been a growing neoliberal influence on the scheme. We go back to 1982, the Accident Compensation Commission was replaced by a statutory corporation with a board. So we moved, this is before the State-Owned Enterprises Act and all of that stuff, but it was still at that point, we saw the corporate model being introduced to ACC. In 1992, the Accident Rehabilitation and Insurance Act, note the change in language from the original legislation. This was Bill Birch. Time, and they took the axe to entitlements during that time as well, did away with the lump sum compensation, and inserted a lot of insurance language into the legislation. And then, of course, by 1998, we had the legislation that privatised the market for ACC and introduced private competitors. Fortunately, that was short-lived, and in 2000, Labor repealed that, which was a very good thing to do, but we still have a number of remnants of that time still in the scheme. The first was full funding. If you have a private insured competitive market, ACC needed to be fully funded on the same basis as private insurers, which means they had to collect enough revenue in order to enable them to fund the costs of injuries that occur today. They needed enough to go into the future. So we're still got with that we have a huge fund, and there's a real question about what the role of the fund is and the kind of things that the fund drives, the behaviours that it drives within ACC. And the other thing that they introduced in repealing it, they introduced the accredited employers scheme, which was basically saying for big providers some of whom quite liked the private model, the ability to insure themselves. Well, yes, you can insure yourselves. You have to self-insure, not through a private insurer. If you're big enough and you've got certain things in place, you can manage your own scheme. And unions will attest to the limitations of that model, which has created a huge problem for them when it comes to ensuring that workers get their proper protections and access through ACC. In 2009, Nick Smith declared that ACC was technically insolvent. That was his interpretation of the fact that in the wake of the GFC, the fund didn't have enough money temporarily to meet its actuarial targets looking into the future. And that was his excuse to once again to slash and burn. So we have the Nick Smith amendments, which Hazel will be talking about in a bit more detail, and the introduction of experience rating, that kind of nominally common sense idea that if you give employers incentives through lesser levies, they will pick up their health and safety practice, which loads of research say is nonsense. So I'll just finish with one last slide, which I don't know if you can read, but that is from this year's annual report, ACC's annual report. And under the title of their underwriting result, that's the language they use, and all the things that are listed below are actually the services that they provide. Hazel and I went to see the Select Committee presentation from the Commission, and if it wasn't from the corporation, and if it wasn't for Jan Logie asking a few questions about actually the people you're meant to look after, what we got was a presentation about the performance of the fund and how well it's doing. And we think that this is the neoliberal framework is manifested in ACC that we have today. We still have a board. It's a board that's been dominated by financial people, not by those who understand the social contract that was entered into at the time that ACC was introduced, that don't have at the front of their minds the people who they are meant to be supporting through the scheme. So with that, I'll hand over to Hazel, who will talk about the immediate changes that we need.
So our colleague up there is changing the presentation. So I was just going to make a couple of things. Before Sir Owen died, I had the privilege to going to his home and talking to him. And he said that the one mistake that he made he probably made others, but the one that he confessed to me, was that when they set up the scheme, it was administered through state insurance. And he said, so those first people who were administering ACC were actually insurance people, and he thinks that ideology or the way of looking at the world just kept on running right through. So I thought that was quite an interesting observation. And the other thing that I was going to add before I start talking is that what Glenn said about neoliberalism is still here, despite the fact that we've had a few changes in the legislation. And one of the areas that I see it most is in rehabilitation. So right now, if you're a rehabilitation provider, you're a company, and you put in a tender to ACC to provide a little bit of rehabilitation, and they've all got titles like training for independence, stay at work, and these little packages of rehabilitation are set number of hours and set tasks with a set objective, and it's not needs-based. And you know that quote that you put up there, it fits exactly. It's just kind of like a market model. And each year I give a lecture free to the AUT students coming through, which are physios. There's a postgraduate course at AUT, physios, OT and nurses. And they all complain, because they're probably nice people, that it's not needs-based, and so they can only deliver the 6 hours for this, and it doesn't matter what the needs are. And I think that that's a real good example of neoliberalism in action. But anyway, so what do we need to change? Right, good. Now this is very boring, so you just have to tolerate me going through it. So it's a list. Essentially, I'm delivering a list. So what happened when Nick Smith came along, he made these changes, and what ACC Futures has done is it keeps on telling the government we want to have a rollback of the Nick Smith changes. That's the slogan that we're using. So he brought them in, and now I'm just going to take you through them, so you just have to tolerate the boringness of it. So with this, firstly, the 6% hearing threshold, with ACC, you don't have a percentage of injury. So if you've got bruising or a cut, it's not a percentage. It's simply that you've got bruising or a cut or a fracture. The only thing that's got a percentage for cover is hearing loss, and he arbitrarily introduced a 6% hearing threshold. 6% doesn't sound a lot, but apparently, and I'm not an audiologist, it actually does represent a hearing loss of some, I don't know if it's significance or a moderate hearing loss. So we want that repealed. No threshold at all. Just if you've got hearing loss from an accident or work, you should get cover. The next one down is with gradual process. So gradual process is when you say are working and you constantly are doing repetitive work, what do you have to show is the type of work that you do would create a greater risk for anyone doing that work. And that, so the kind of example you come across, or someone like me comes across, one of my clients might have a bladder cancer, and he is, he's a police person, isn't he? And he cleans out meth labs, and he's got this bladder cancer. And we have to argue that people cleaning out meth labs are likely to get bladder cancer. There's hardly any studies at all on police persons cleaning out meth labs. So we have to try and get over that barrier rather than being able to say he was exposed to products in the meth lab that gave him the bladder cancer. I'm sure I've been completely complicated and you don't understand a word I'm saying, but anyway, we want to make it easier for people to get cover. There used to be a ministerial advisory committee that would advise the minister on these kind of conditions that could give rise to injury. A very good example that Wattie Watson talks about from the firefighters is that a number of firefighters get cancers, and she would be saying, you can't list every single toxin that a firefighter is going to get exposed to in a fire, whereas the schedule in the Act means that you have to be able to list and identify every toxin, and that's not possible. So we're trying to get the Ministerial Advisory Committee reinstated so that we can give good advice about certain injuries and illnesses that workers contract, and we need to update the schedule accordingly. One of the mean ones, which I know that Ruth Dyson also felt very upset about, is that people who attempt suicide and don't succeed, or people who do succeed, they're disentitled from any cover. And I always think that that's really mean, because often it's because the person's got a mental injury or a mental condition that leads them to this. So we'd want that disentitlement taken out. And the other thing that is very neoliberal in my view, and I've been sitting at my computer all day working on one of these cases, that what ACC says is that if you can work in any other job, not your pre-injury job, for 30 hours, they will suspend your weekly compensation. So that was introduced by National. Unfortunately, Labor didn't take it out, and we've still got it there, but it's used as it's a brutal way of treating people to just suspend them. So the case that I'm working on, the woman, what do you call it, a harness racer, a person, jockey, is it? Jockey. And Quinn's got a sort of a horsey type family, so he knows these things. Harness racing she does, doesn't she? She fell out of the harness, is that right? Injured herself, and she loves the job, can't go back to it, and they says that she can be a sales representative in a liquor store, right? And so they can cut her off. They cut her off. So we want to get rid of that entirely and have proper rehabilitation. Oh God, I can't read that from here. So there are other changes. So we think that, what Glenn put up there about the mosque shooting, that would be extending cover to the people who have mental injury for non-work traumatic events. And in fact, Quinn tells me that that B Woodhouse has just won that case of the non-work-related asbestos disease. That apparently came through on the news today, so that's fantastic. And also cover should be granted when diagnosis evolves. Am I completely boring you? Are you managing to sort of stay with it? It is pretty boring. But what I mean by this is, now that we've got MRI imaging, a person goes, you strain your ankle or whatever, and probably that's not a good example, your shoulder's more likely, strain your shoulder, and you'll just get cover for a strain. But when you get your MRI, that you've actually got a tear. And what happens is ACC does not necessarily cover the tear. So people like me are arguing with ACC to get surgery for the tear because all the person's got cover for is the strain. It's very irritating. Cover for birthing injuries, and if you could just shift that up. Oh yes, this is terrible. Yes, so if you get no weekly compensation if you're an earner at the time of injury, but by the time you get incapacitated, you're no longer an earner. And what Quinn's always pointing out is that that really disadvantages women in particular who may be out of the workforce, so they're injured perhaps whilst they're working, and then the incapacity arises when they're out of the workforce. Well, they're not eligible for weekly compensation. That's really, quite disadvantaged. That issue there comes up a lot. I remember I had a guy that used to be at TY Point, Mike, with the pot room asthma. And what a lot of people do is they'll get an injury like pot room asthma, they'll leave the job. I think he was medically unfit for work to continue to work down there. He then, does this and that, and then he eventually becomes a taxi driver, and then he kind of goes out of work because he, can't breathe. And by the time he comes to me, he's not earning because he's what they call soldiered on for a while and then can no longer do it. And he won't be eligible, well, he wasn't eligible for weekly compensation. I took it to the district court. I had Judge Beattie at the time. And Judge Beattie said, look, I could really see your case here. I really feel sympathetic to your guy with pot room asthma who became a taxi driver and then he couldn't do that anymore. But I can't do anything about it. That's how the law reads. And so even though the judiciary thought it was a nonsense, that's what the law says. Oh yeah, and then there's some stuff that lawyers get irritated about, which is that ACC mucks around for ages and ages, and when Glenn puts up administrative efficiency, today, you know, Quinn rings up ACC, 17 minutes later, and the person isn't there. It's not really very efficient, despite their business improvement program. And what we're wanting is that if they don't issue a decision within a certain period of time, we can take it to review. And then changes of the way, well, this is getting so boring. Weekly compensation is taxed when it's backdated. So if we get a person arrears of weekly compensation, it gets all paid in a lump, and they tax it all at the highest rate, even though they may have accrued it over 5 years. You'd understand that, you know, and it seems to disadvantage people. We wrote a submission to the tax working group, but didn't make any headway on it. Nor should holiday pay be abated. That means that you earned your holiday pay over a period of time prior to your injury, yet if you get your holiday pay at termination, they take the lot back off you. So these are all of these things. We want better board representation, as Glenn said when we went to listen to Paula Rebstock speaking on her Zoom to the Select Committee. All she managed to talk about was the fund. And we don't think it represents workers or disabled persons or Māori and Pacifica or health practitioners. We also wanted a greater pool of people in the scheme who can assess people's injury. What ACC has a list, and people who don't know who's out there in the medical community have got no idea who to go to. So if you're wanting to get an assessment, you'll just get sent to the ACC assessors. They're paid by ACC, and what's that expression? Those who pay the piper, they sing the tune or something like that, and that's what seems to happen. You've got assessors who appear to favour ACC compared to the claimant. The AMA guide, which is how you assess lump sum, completely outdated now, and it's very gender biased. So I've had a client who was raped, and when we took her for the AMA assessment, it didn't really take into account the harm that she suffered because of that. So those sort of things need to change. God, and I can go on forever. I feel I'm just boring you to death there. Full-time work should be defined as 37.5 rather than 30 hours. And, well, I think I might stop there because I think you will all go to sleep. See, Mike's yawning. Okay, is there anything more on there, or have I done enough? So those are the menu of things that we want changing, and you can see that they're sort of small in item, but significant for the claimant in their life, essentially.
Can you hear me? It just sounds a bit boomy from here. You're okay? Good. Just raise your hand and shout out if you can't. Yeah. No, is that better? Yeah? Okay. I haven't got a PowerPoint, sorry. Kia ora koutou, and thank you for this opportunity. I am an historian, including of our disability history, and we have a lot to learn about the way ahead by considering where we have come from, that Te Ao Māori sense of walking backwards into the future. We acknowledge the important work that Owen Woodhouse and his allies did in the 1960s and 70s for those who had been injured and who went on to establish the Accident Compensation Commission. And my friend J.B. Munro, who helped nurture the new organisation when he was an MP in the Kirk government and championed disability generally. And all those disabled people and their families affected by government policies. We bring them with us today. Now, I would like to start with a story. In 1969, when he was 17, my friend Martin was a pillion passenger on a motorbike which was hit by a car pulling out of a side street. Martin was paralysed from the chest down. He spent a year in Middlemore Hospital and went from there back to school to finish 7th form, at least in the parts of the school he could access by wheelchair. It took that year for his widowed mother to get a state advances loan to make her house accessible for Martin to come home. In hospital, the talk was about who had grounds to sue and who didn't. Martin did. His mother had a relative who knew someone in a law firm and who, after about 3 years, won Martin's claim against the driver who was at fault and hit the driver's car insurance. He won a lump sum, of which the hospital immediately took a big chunk. 4 years later, so that was 1969, 4 years later, Martin was an academic teaching disability and social policy at Massey University, one of only a handful of disabled academics in the country, and teaching probably the only such course in New Zealand. He led a team which successfully applied for funding from the Health Research Council for a longitudinal study on spinal cord injury. The 3-year study followed all those leaving the 2 spinal units in 2007. The mainly anecdotal data available up till then about the differences between those with spinal cord injury covered by ACC and those without is described in the study, and this is a quote. "The socio-economic support available when they leave the units varies markedly. Those who are eligible for full accident compensation potentially receive a lump sum payment, earnings-related compensation, housing and home alterations, transport, for example, modified motor vehicle, aids and appliances, vocational support, and personal assistance. If people were in regular paid employment before their spinal cord injury, earnings-related compensation provides up to 80% of their pre-injury wages until they return to paid employment. Those not covered by ACC are left to the more restrictive, less generous and less timely support through the Ministry of Health." So that was one of the initial quotes from their application. And a 2013 report of the initial findings by the study, which was on the Massey website, provided more details. And this again is a quote. "The study by Massey University and University of Otago researchers recruited 118 people aged 16 to 64 from New Zealand's 2 spinal units, Auckland and Burwood. There were 93 participants covered by ACC and 25 not covered. And the participants were followed with interviews at 6, 18 and 30 months after their injury. That took from 2007 to 2009. So 93 covered by ACC, 25 not covered. And a bit of a disclaimer here. I accompanied Martin to some of these interviews as they took place all over New Zealand, which can be logistically difficult for a traveller with spinal cord injury, although I didn't actually attend the interviews, of course. And he did mention that participants were more open when they realised that he had lived experience of spinal cord injury. So quoting again from the Massey website, "The research found that the non-ACC group were less likely to return to work. The non-ACC group were also more likely to have insufficient household income to meet their everyday needs, such as accommodation, food and clothing. For the non-ACC group, and remember this is 2010 data, median income declined by 45% over 30 months, and that was from 36,500 to 19,000. While the median income of the ACC group increased from 40 to 45, almost 46,000. Sarah Derrett, one of the researchers, said, "A key message from this research is that ACC performs very well in terms of both helping people return to work and preventing the downward spiral into poverty. However, at present, the types of supports available to New Zealanders not covered and with the same level of impairment are unfair. Martin, the study's principal investigator, said, and quote, that the findings highlight the importance of ACC in New Zealand. The scheme is the envy of many other countries. Our findings provide strong support for the extension of the scheme to those with non-traumatic spinal cord injuries. It could be a good time to revisit the idea of extending ACC cover to those who are not currently eligible. This would be in line with the principles of social equity as outlined in Sir Owen Woodhouse's report. This study that I've just referred to only looked at spinal cord injury, but the report of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, the recent one, found extensive inequities in financial assistance for people with health conditions and impairments, depending on cause. It found that, and this is an edited quote, the Ministry of Social Development, Ministry of Health, and ACC work across the health and disability sector, delivering support and services to a sometimes shared client base. The three agencies have very different incentives and purposes, which has led to disparate and inequitable outcomes for disabled people, both accident and medically diagnosed. Levels of income support and integrated services for people with similar disabilities vary, depending on whether people are eligible for ACC income replacement payments or much less generous means-tested payments through the welfare system. The report in WEAG provided three scenario tables, I think they were done by Ganesh Nana, showing that the amount of, three different scenarios, showing that the amount of financial assistance people received when under ACC is higher than that provided by MSD for the same level of incapacity. And you can readily find these tables in the report. WEAG suggested that the government consider how best to extend the advantage of an ACC approach for those with disability and illness, particularly long-term, not caused by an accident, to reduce this inequity. Sir Geoffrey Palmer, a one-time assistant to Woodhouse, and a champion ever since of a unified system of disability, accident and income support, was even blunter in his 2018 Woodhouse lecture, which was headlined, "Unjust discriminatory aspects of the system need to be eradicated." He said there should be a single, unified system, not only for people incapacitated by accidents, but also those incapacitated by sickness or otherwise disabled, as intended by Sir Owen in 1967. But he said only about half that report's bold, almost revolutionary recommendations went on to be included in the 1972 Act. He quoted a paragraph in the Woodhouse report that said, "Informal and simple procedure should be the key to all proceedings. Applications should not be made to depend upon any formal type of claim. Adversary techniques should not be used, and a drift to legalism avoided." So Geoffrey said that this was a scheme to do away with the need for lawyers when claiming compensation for personal injury. But now, this is 2018, the legislation is so intricate that lawyers are often needed. He went on to say, "We do not seem willing to grasp the nettle and design what a rational and humane system of income support looks like. Fairness demands a policy response, and one that is properly worked through. We need now a fresh infusion of Woodhouse boldness and vision." So, calls to reform the system are not new. There are many inequities in coverage, and several have been in the news lately and have been mentioned here tonight, such as birth injury, mental trauma, such as from the Christchurch mosque attacks, better access for Maori and women. Meanwhile, much time and energy is going into litigation and deciding what is and what is not covered. And now we also have new international obligations such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to consider. The early 1970s was a time of transformation in many areas, and today there is a sense that such reformative potential is again possible. I have toned down my earlier call for a Royal Commission, to be chaired by Sir Geoffrey. I have been told by Cabinet Ministers that this government is not going to have any more Royal Commissions, but some sort of inquiry is required, even one undertaken by a select committee. Grant Robertson's idea of social insurance is interesting. This reminds me of the early potential of ACC that was never realised. If it can be made as broad as possible, include everyone, including those in not unpaid employment, it has some potential as part of the answer. There has been a lot of work in the disability policy sector in the last few years, developing what are called the Enabling Good Lives Principles. These principles are person-centred and mana-enhancing, and are about inclusion and trusting disabled people to decide for themselves what they need for a good life. A disability support system based on the Enabling Good Lives principles, called Mana Whakaha, is being developed in the Manawatu, and it's governed and led by disabled people themselves. It has a system of connectors working with those seeking support, and it will hopefully roll out around the country, not too distant future. It would be good to somehow incorporate that approach into a new re-envisaged universal system, which also brings in the Woodhouse Principles. Government policy is also to encourage ministries and ministers to work together. There is now the same minister, Carmel Sepuloni for ACC, disability issues and MSD. And the Minister of Health, Andrew Little, is a former ACC board member who has in the past supported the extension and reform of the scheme. The 2020 Labour Party election manifesto included the words, "As part of the welfare overhaul, Labour will examine inequities between support through ACC and the welfare and health system for disabled people and people with health conditions." This government is keen on ticking off manifesto commitments, so let's give them a push. Thank you.
I'm just going to say a couple of words very quickly about the reflections on the way forward. And the reason we held the conference on the 30th of April was to help us to distill a view. Clearly, there's massive evidence to demonstrate there's a time for a change. We need to reform ACC. The question of what our asks are going to be is something that we have still to actually work through. There's a lot of really good stuff came out of that day on the 30th of April. And the last time we did that was back in 2011 or 12. We had another one-day seminar, and that the result of that was a manifesto that we took forward. And Hazel's, a lot of the things that Hazel's talked about in her session, reflects the positions that we developed at that time. So it's a bit of a case of watch this space, but we are intending in a fairly short space of time to firm up some very specific views about a range of issues and start to promote them more actively with the government. We've met with the minister, the new minister, and have got a regular series of meetings hopefully in place with her. But we need to establish a clear mandate, and then we'll become much more active in this space is what we intend to do. So some high-level comments there, but we're open to any questions that people may have.
Right. Thanks very much, Glenn and Hazel and Hilary. Right, floor is open for questions. Anybody like to, yes?
There's a microphone behind you as well.
I'll just take this one over there.
Well, I've heard a lot of great common sense this evening. It's hard to select from all the things that are wrong what to talk about, but one thing that stood out for me that's completely meaningless is the 6% decline in hearing. because there's no measure, unless it's buried somewhere and wasn't mentioned, what this actually means. Because if you lose 6% from the top of your hearing, you can't understand a thing. Whereas if it's from the bottom, it's probably okay. It's nonsense. It shouldn't even be there. It's legally impossible.
Yes.
Any other? Just get the microphone yourself, Pat. We've only got one runner.
I've got a young woman, granddaughter, sort of, who just celebrated her 16th birthday in the Burwood spinal unit, having been dared to dive into some water which turned out to be 2 foot deep. And so what Hilary was saying really worries me about Sophie's future. But what I wanted to find out more about is that social insurance, extending the concept to if you have the accident of losing your job, and maybe Glenn could say something about that.
Well, you know, this is something obviously that the government, you're talking about the thing the government announced it in the budget that they're going to do more work on. Look, we don't know anything much more than what's out there in the public space about this. And it's something we're going to watch with interest. I mean, within the coalition, there's a range of views on that topic. And we have to kind of work through what we're going to do with that. But at the very least, you know, creating a new system of social insurance around employment is going to butt up against ACC, and we're going to have to figure out what that means for ACC, whether there are good things in that we can leverage off, or whether there are things that we need to be anxious to make sure that key principles of ACC aren't undermined by. But either way, we do need to get on top of that. Yeah, I don't think I can say much more at this until we can find out a bit more, really.
Pat, the only other thing that I'd add is that I was so pleased when they used the 80% figure, because what I've always been nervous about is when Cullen was our Minister of Finance, you know, he put to the CTU the idea that we drop it down to 60% after a period of time. And it always worried me that that kind of thinking might be lurking around. So when they said 80%, I went, oh, thank God. But I was wanting to follow up 2 points that Hilary made. So one of the things that I don't think has been taken into account is the impact of vocational independence. The majority of people stay on earnings-related compensation for about 2 years, and then they're flicked off the scheme. So you don't really get a long term on ACC unless you're really seriously disabled. So that's the first point. The second point is that there's been a number of studies to show that people, when they go on ACC, do not increase their earnings. They actually are worse off than they were when they were well. So it's not true to say that people have enhanced earnings afterwards.
This was one specific study that...
Yeah.
That's what they found in their study.
Yes, but I wouldn't repeat it too often.
On spinal cord injury specifically.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I want to... I've worked in the ACC dispute area for a long time, but I'm going to... Yes, I was a reviewer. So I know a lot about it. So I'm not going to go into the details of that Hazel mentioned, except I agree about the Vandy decision. It needs to change. The Vandy decision.
Yes.
But I really want to comment on what Hilary said, because I agree with everything she said, and Michael Cullen suggested it years ago. And I think if you actually come round to it, people understand, because basically, in spite of what you might say, Hazel, ACC's the Rolls-Royce and the health system's the Mini, really, and particularly for serious injury, right? For serious injury, ACC does a bloody good job. And I mean, I know people who've worked in the system and, you know, they've got really good benefits. But the problem about it is actually finding the money. So, I mean, I think you can have the argument about the justice and fairness, and everyone will agree, but you have to find a system where you can actually increase those benefits for those on and rehab for those on disability without actually making ACC less than a Rolls Royce, you know, and that's the problem. And so you have to find a way to do that. The second thing I want to talk about neoliberalism, because when I think about neoliberalism, I think about contracting. And it was a Labour government who actually made a real neoliberal decision in terms of dispute resolution, for example. They actually, under Labour, they decided that they would contract the dispute system to private companies, and now you have two competing companies in terms of review. Now that seems totally against the whole ethos, where you have no other way in the justice system that I know, and I call that part of the justice system or dispute system, where you've actually got private companies. I mean, I thought Labour didn't believe in it, but they do. But the other thing is that in terms of contracting, I mean, I just get so mad when you actually talk about the ACC board. Why do you have to argue about them not investing in fossil fuels? If you have any sense, if I was a minister, you just bloody well tell them, otherwise we'll get rid of you because you've got a lot of Tories on there. Get rid of the bastards and put people on who'll do what you want, right? But that's the model that they've got, you see. They've got that sort of model that actually says, you know, we don't make the decisions. It's not our fault that they invest in fossil fuels. It's because they make the decision and have the statutory responsibility. But it's more in terms of ACC. ACC probably invests enough money they could own half the private hospitals in New Zealand. And so they have this thing of contracting out to private hospitals, contracting out to rehab people. Why? And it really pisses me off, not just in the ACC field, because we don't have power, whether it's in justice in our prisons or whether it's in social welfare, because we've got other people doing it. We've got companies doing it. The old days, what used to happen is that you had the government departments not just doing the policy, they would do the actual work. And that's what's happened with ACC. They started off with that model and they've continued and it's got worse. And I just think in terms of neoliberalism, we forget about contracting. And ACC's full of contracting. And the other thing that's happened recently, and I don't know, Hazel, because I'm no longer around, but they've had this sort of change thing. And the number of staff that have who have left ACC are really pissed off. They've lost the institutional knowledge, and they have this, rather than being a case manager, you know, you just deal with a whole lot of different people. And you know, somebody's probably got a bonus for doing it, but the place is not a happy place, I tell you. It is not happy at all. And it's that, you need that institutional knowledge in terms of that and the people working it for it to be effective. Anyway, so that's a bit of a rave. I could talk about other entitlements if you like, but I won't.
Okay. We'll feature you later, yeah. Right, any comments?
Yeah, just, I think we're all nodding madly up here. Yeah, it's absolutely, your comments about neoliberalism are right. You know, the contracting model, that transactional approach to things, the whole new public management stuff. Len, in his presentation at the conference, talked a lot about the kind of the impact of that on the public service and the loss, the gap between delivery and policy making. So concur with you on that. And do you want to say some comments?
Yeah. Just about social insurance, Grant is very keen on it. He has a lot of power. So we're going to be hearing more about it. So we have to make sure his idea is extended to something that is holistic as possible.
Yes, Len?
Oh, thanks. Actually, if Grant was serious about it, of course, he wouldn't have an ACC board that looks more like a banker's one. And, you know, the very last appointment in April was of an Australian actuary. Now, what we know is actuaries are a wee bit like, you know, you can bring and buy them. You buy them on the spot market when you need them. You don't put them on your board. And they're the sort of people you're talking about, I think, Ken. And I think one of the serious things is that boards play a critically important role in offering advice and thinking, and also the way the institution itself thinks. And it seems to me that I never realised it till I looked last month, at just how totally irrelevant the ACC board as a group is for anything that's involved in the concept of social insurance. Just to make another comment, which is the thing that was being talked about with contracting is extremely important, and what you're talking about with fragmentation, because what it means is that in many areas, whether it's home help for your mother or whatever, where people are compartmentalising those things, the people that do it are generally low paid, but in order to get the job done that they like, they do the rest of it for nothing. And so actually what we have done is we've turned quite a lot of low-paid workers into charity operators, even though the organisation that they're working for is often quite well off. And we're seeing this in so many areas, and this is I think one of the worst parts of the contracting that we've created. We've forgotten that the people at the bottom of with the work on the contract are actually ending up ultimately having to do a lot more, so they don't walk away and seeing someone, you know, sort of stuffed for food that day or anything.
You've got to...
So now.
Steve Mahari is our new chair.
Yeah, this is better now. Yes. Oh. Anyhow, yeah, Steve Mahari is the new chair, and he'll be starting soon. So that's been a big backlog. A big blockage for several years. We don't know what the board is, but we have been lobbying to get some, people who know a bit about. As from consumer perspective, from disability perspective, from all sorts of other perspectives. So, and we have taken it up with the minister, who I think has also felt a bit powerless. But, these things we just have to keep getting, I think a change of the board would be really important, but these things take time.
Bugger that.
Ken Douglas, I've got a question for you all in the context of something that's worried me for a long, long time. The very first time that Michael Cullen suggested that benefits should be paid out of ACC terrified me, because it seemed to be putting two different things into the same basket. And his argument essentially was, as I remember, was, well, why should a person on a benefit get less than a person on ACC? Well, of course, the ACC was based on a compensation for an injury of which an employer had a particular responsibility. So my question is it still feasible to push benefits and effective employer responsibility to ensure safety and pay compensation where they have not protected those workers in the same system? I think that, for me, sits at the nub of this general problem, because they'll invent all sorts of mechanisms, commercial mechanisms, because that's why Paula Rebstock's got this job. She is an evil person, a very evil person. I've had the personal discussion with her about the practice of ACC immediately declining every claim that's made against them. First instruction is, we reject it. Doing what? Most workers don't have the capacity to challenge it. Certainly some workers have, as a consequence of their professional experience and so on, are able to do it. And the second bites, they then parade in a different group of assessors. And you never meet these assessors that are sitting in some sort of room somewhere. So I've still got this sharp question in my mind is, are we actually being realistic and trying to get an equitable answer to both the accidents that employers should be responsible for and benefits that society as a whole should be responsible for?
Ken, I think you've struck the nail on the head, because within ACC Futures itself, that dilemma exists. So someone like me, union background, based on workers' comp, I don't want to see any reduction. So that's why 80% and all of the things that I talk about, I want to hang on to. So I don't want it to race to the bottom. So now I think there's tension within ACC Futures, which I don't know how we're going to resolve it, but I think what you're saying is very real, and that's why I think Glenn's saying we've got to keep a very close eye on the social insurance debate to see how that plays out. But I think it's hard. It's hard. Glenn or Hilary, you want to comment?
No, not really. I think you've said it.
Other questions? Sorry. Well, a couple of things from, I think several things. What are the ways that those of us who kind of, muddle around the edges of the decision-making apparatus in our wonderful country can do to assist the direction in which you want to take ACC Futures? And that's part of the point of having this event for us tonight, to say, okay, how can the rest of us assist? The second thing is, I think the point that Ken's made about the contracting process is actually a major fracture line. And I was talking about this with somebody earlier today, because the thing that is increasingly apparent with a government that is requiring to now move into delivery phase, that the contractual ethos that's permeated the whole of government is actually making that almost impossible. I was talking with somebody at the weekend who's working in the area of the track and trace sort of things, and that's the problem, that the delivery is not facilitated by the methods that are being used. So that's just another point that it seems to me that it is something that we need to be raising more and more in a more focused way with this government, that unless they deal to those processes, then the real problem they've got of delivery will not be possible. Anyway, just any thoughts or comments on those two things? What can we do, and how important is that contract process, or that monitoring and all the rest of it?
Look, I think we'd welcome all the support we can get. If you go to the ACC Futures website, which is a pretty crappy old thing, we do have a long list of organisations that have affiliated, or we're going through a process of checking, because a lot of those organisations put their hands up a long time ago, and we're just double checking which ones are still interested and active. But alongside that, we've got a number of individuals who are keen and interested in ACC and have been part of our ACC Futures group. So if anyone's interested in being on our Google group, if perhaps give their name to Quinn here just before you leave, and he can make sure that you get on the mailing list and be part of the debate. And then as we move into more of an active phase, no doubt there'll be things that we want people to do, so keep an eye out for that and participate in all of that. With regards to your comments about delivery, as a former PSA National Secretary, I couldn't agree with you more about the nature of our public service and how that's hampered delivery. I mean, I heard the other day that the transition unit for the health system is comprised primarily of
Well, yeah, I think, well, sorry.
Just to mention that there's a Facebook page too, so
Right, okay. Then.
One wee comment. You've now got a public sector where probably no one above middle-level management has ever worked in an environment other than that was created in the late 80s. And as a consequence, it would be almost impossible to have an option in a paper drafted by anyone in the New Zealand Public Service that actually proposed something that didn't involve an improved form of contracting. Secondly, that one of the important things is in the past, if you look at, say, COVID-19, what you would have found as an emergency, some of the best brains from a whole lot of mixed departments would come in, and it would be a tremendous experience for them for a year that would do their career. Now we give it to Deloitte. In fact, it's very rare when you go to we hire consultants to decide how do we prepare a contract in order to contract other people. And I think we have become so bereft that it's important to really rethink what we're actually doing. And I don't think that you will find changing the system that you've got in its even specific parts as something that will be particularly easy.
I never thought it would be particularly easy. I think but since we've started on this discussion, one of the things that does intrigue me, for example, is to what extent are the big four companies penetrated into our public service? Is anybody monitoring it or measuring it or giving us any idea of how far it's gone and what are the effects of that? So we can continue discussion if you like, or perhaps welcome any suggestions as to ways we might approach some of those issues. Because, I mean, for example, a lot of us talked about the need for a Ministry of Works, you know, and when you raise that, as it was raised in the Labour Party recently, the people under 30 say, oh, that's an old idea. And so we need a new language. But what is really being asked for, as I understand it, is competence that isn't a competence in transaction, but a competence in delivery. And that's what we need to, it seems to me, to attract back into the government service. Because that, in a way, is what we used to have, and until 1984, it did work perhaps better than today. Anyway, I'm going on too long, perhaps. Thank you very much to Glenn and Hazel and Hilary, and thank you everyone else for the discussion tonight. And as I said, we welcome any suggestions or further ideas as to how we might progress some of this discussion. Thank you.